This is an ABC podcast.
Hello there, Geraldine Dood with you, and a big welcome to Extra. It's just lovely to have you company each Monday. A little bit later in this hour, learning a new skill when you're an adult. It's a little challenge, I can speak from personal experience. Anyway, we've got a lovely interview for you. I think you'll really enjoy it. And also Sue Boy joining us for the second in our Modern Diplomacy series. Now, when the pandemic hit last year, I think we were all a little bit shocked to realise just how dependent we'd become on global supply chains, how much we'd allowed our own manufacturing capability to decline. In fact, Australia holds the record for having the smallest domestic manufacturing sector relative to how much we use of any industrial country. It led to calls to, quotes, make Australia make again. And in October, the federal government responded with a $1.5 billion plan aiming to boost manufacturing in 6 key areas: medical products, food and beverage, recycling and clean energy, and defence and space. Manufacturing didn't seem to feature as much in the discussion around this year's budget, but the Financial Review columnist Andrew Clark suggested that it was here, in fact, that you could see hints of longer-term policy thinking. So might we really see a revitalisation of manufacturing in Australia, but don't expect it, so the specialists say, to resemble what we once knew? I'm joined now by David Tutor, who's CEO and Managing Director of the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC, and Dr. Jim Stanford's with us too, who's an economist and Director of the Centre for Future Work. He published a very interesting report last July titled A Fair Share for Australian Manufacturing. Welcome to you both.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Jim,
Yes,
just to get some context first, what state was our manufacturing sector in before the pandemic?
Well, when the pandemic hit, unfortunately, manufacturing in Australia had been eroding seriously, really, for a couple of decades, since the turn of the century. We had lost about 200,000 jobs. We had seen the complete shutdown of important manufacturing industries, obviously including car manufacturing. And we had seen, as you mentioned, a growing dependence on imports for everything. Then the pandemic hit and sort of made us realize how vulnerable we are. And the government pledged to do something about it, but unfortunately things have only gotten worse. We've lost another 20,000 jobs in the last year of the pandemic alone. So I think the pandemic was a wake-up call, but there's no sign yet that we're prepared to take the measures necessary to turn that long-term trend around.
Now, of course, as you say, for many years the conventional wisdom was that as a high-wage, resource-rich economy, we just couldn't compete effectively in manufacturing, nor did we need to.
Yeah, I think it's that nor did we need to part that frankly was the most damaging kind of dimension of that complacency. You know, we had a mining boom. We had a time when, we thought we could live the good life just by digging out the stuff that lies under our feet, our coal and iron ore and other mineral exports. And we also, for some of that time anyways, had very low unemployment rates. So people thought we don't need those industrial jobs. And that was wrong. I mean, we should have known that was wrong at the time. Obviously, a sophisticated, high-value, innovation-intensive economy wants to do more than just extract and export raw resources. We want to add value to those resources. That's where the big money is. You see
yes.
That, and it's
We're just having a little bit of trouble with your line, I see, going in and out.
Oh.
But it is also true, isn't it, that there's been some very interesting thinking on this, because it just more of late, that sense that sophisticated economies need sophisticated manufacturing at some level to retain their broader sophistication, and that actually it has a geopolitical influence as well, strangely enough. So opinions are shifting, it would be fair to say, of late. Is that a reasonable comment?
I believe so. Yeah, I think that there's a common sense mentality that Australia has to make things again. And the pandemic obviously highlighted that. We couldn't even make masks, let alone high-tech vaccines and respirators and so on. And I think that, in a way, was a bit of a wake-up call for Australians to realize we need a well-rounded economy, not just an extractive economy.
And David, is this decline, or is that sense that has just been outlined by Jim, is that something you notice as well? Because you've spent 25 years working in the automotive industry, so you can speak with some experience.
Yeah, I can. And 15 of that was spent working with taking an Australian company from Melbourne into the world. And so I know just how hard it is to export and to build global business models. I've been working in a different space in the last 4 years, which has been around incentivizing companies to invest in design and research and development with some of Australia's smartest technical universities in the CSIRO. And I've seen for the last few years a real groundswell and a change in an appetite for investment in manufacturing. So it's really interesting to see this observation that manufacturing is now fashionable again. I do, however, that it's still concept of manufacturing being about producing things. And actually manufacturing needs to be in Australia far more than that. It needs to be embracing the design for manufacturing, the software, the research, the logistics, and coming up with smart solutions that are complex products that we can take to the world. So I worry that the argument about manufacturing still has a paradigm associated with dingy factories. And that couldn't be further from the truth from what we're seeing happening.
I know that you worry that at the moment we produce far fewer manufactured goods than we use. This seems to be a very important metric. Do you think we need to try to strike a better balance, do you, David? And that's that whole question about whether we make our economy more complex, which was the big finding from that CSIRO report, I think, in 2019.
Yeah, that's right. I think there have been any number of reports where Australia has not been at the right end of the table that we'd like to have seen them. And complexity was yet another one, that where we do export things, we export things of low complexity and therefore low value add. I think, Jim's quoted it.
We're just having trouble with your line. We're going to ring you back. We're going to ring you back, David. Your line is just a bit fragile, so we'll come back to you. And I'll go to you, Jim. Striking a balance that you say other OECD countries currently do much better than us is something that you emphasise in your report. How do they do that, and could we copy them?
Yes, we can learn a lot of lessons. There's no one magic recipe to follow, but of the 36 countries in the OECD, Australia is dead last. We only produce about 2/3 as much value added as we consume. And as David mentioned, we are more weighted in that kind of low technology end of the manufacturing spectrum. So I'd say the true balance is even worse than that number makes it seem. And immediately you can get rid of this idea that we lost manufacturing because we're too expensive. You look at other countries that are exporting more than they import, that produce more manufactured goods than they use. And there are countries like Germany and Switzerland and Japan. And these are not low-wage countries. These are not places where you go to set up a factory because the labor is cheap. Those are countries that invested in technology and robots and artificial intelligence and invested in jobs and skills and people and carved out their own respective niches in areas where their innovation and their proprietary advantages allowed them to sell very expensive well-made products into the world market. And there's absolutely no reason Australia can't do the same. I think it's more a policy failure than an economic failure, that we took manufacturing for granted and decided that we didn't need it anymore.
Yeah, David, I think you're back with a better line. One of our listeners just said, sounds like we need to manufacture a reliable phone line, which I must say had crossed my mind.
True? You can't participate in a digital economy without a good internet connection, and that's the reality.
Yes, quite so. Look, we've just been talking about how other countries are doing it. It just sounds like some of them decided to pick winners, A. B, did they have a different approach to learning and teaching? Was there something deeper? And I might add, access to capital. So there do seem to be some factors here. Can you comment on that with your experience?
Yeah, there are many factors. I've been very fortunate to travel around many countries, and the risk appetite here is lower, and I think that's because we've relied on other industries. I also sense that countries that are more progressive have, I guess, a long-term, well-thought-through industrial strategy. Manufacturing is both an industry, but it's also a set of enabling capabilities across all industry sectors. And so when you think of the application of whether it's robotics or virtual reality or 3D printing or just supply chain and logistics solutions, you've got this manufacturing know-how that lifts all industries. And so we've gone down a path in Australia recently of taking that picking winners approach, if you like. The government has announced 6 national manufacturing priority sectors. But broadly, that is the start of an industrial strategy. The important thing is for us to be investing in the capabilities that underpin that. And that goes all the way back to things like design, engineering, logistics, and importantly, things like software and digital skills as well. So for me, it's about building the bedrock, and that's where the investment may create multipliers across many industry sectors.
When you say we're more risk averse, tell us more, please.
Yeah, I think what I'm seeing is I've met fantastic businesses in my travels and lots of companies we've supported through our CRC. We're characterised in many industries by having a much higher proportion of small and medium businesses. And there are some great companies with great ideas, but what's holding them back is they tend to keep those ideas to themselves. And so what you are seeing more and more in other countries is a lot more collaboration across industry sectors. My worry that what we've really lost with the end of the automotive industry, yes, we lost jobs, we lost the capability to build complex products. But actually what we've really lost is a traditional industrial structure where you have 3 or 4 large companies at the top, like a Ford or a General Motors or a Toyota, who then work with hundreds of tiered suppliers. And those big companies lift the capability in terms of standards and quality and certification and investment and risk appetite of everyone in those supply chains.
So they almost train the investors as well, do they?
They almost train the investors, and they create a critical mass. One of the other things we talk about is a lack of scale, and I think that's been exposed as we try and work out what we do need to make here in Australia. But we've lost that structure. So it's tempting to compare ourselves with other countries and try and replicate what they do, but we've got to do it and acknowledge the uniqueness that Australia has. What we do, however, is an abundance of natural resources, both in everything from food through to critical minerals that the world is now desperate to get hold of. So that the opportunity is to find a way to do a lot more design and engineering and create value so that we're competing and exporting, not so much on cost, but on the value of what we're creating and seen as a major contributor to the world of innovation and manufacturing.
Do you think we need more focus on different things, Jim? For instance, energy. I mean, people have been talking about this whole notion of us being a renewable superpower, and it is nominated, energy, as one of the 6 focus areas. But in terms of, an attitudinal shift, do you think that this offers something?
Oh, I think there's an enormous opportunity, Geraldine, to leverage Australia's renewable energy resource, as well as all of those minerals that David was just mentioning. Australia is the biggest exporter of lithium, and everybody needs lithium for all of those batteries, big and small, that are going into these new products that are part of the energy revolution that's happening. So. And we actually still remember how to make vehicles. Like, we have lost the conventional vehicle industry, but we do have skills and engineers and productive capacities that really could be reactivated, not just to snap our fingers and go back to the previous industry, but to take advantage of those capabilities, as David says, and build a new industry. So renewable energy could absolutely be one of the hooks for the flowering of a whole new set of manufacturing industries, both that feed into renewable energy developments with all of the manufactured products, but that also use renewable energy as a cheap input. We could have a huge cost advantage if we really made the most of that. The problem is that we've been so half-hearted about embracing the renewable energy situation, where the government makes fun of electric vehicles and isn't even sure that we should support renewable energy. And this holds back the investors as well, because they don't even know that Australia is in this game let alone being a good place to invest in making the most of it.
Yeah, well, hopefully that's about to change. I have had one listener say, isn't it a problem for sophisticated economies, though, that manufacturing will be more and more robotic with fewer net jobs, Jim?
Well, I'm not concerned really that is the biggest problem that we face. For sure, there are technological changes happening, but remember, the robots themselves didn't fall from the sky. The robots themselves had to be designed and engineered and manufactured and installed and maintained. And on the whole, this kind of gets back to David's point about the capabilities. I think we do need to have factories in Australia. It's not enough to think that we're just going to do the engineering and design function and then have all the actual manufacturing work, direct manufacturing work put somewhere else. But David's right that those manufacturing facilities of the future are not going to look like the ones that we used to have. And the fact that there will be a lot of robotics and a lot of automation and the Internet of Things, as it's called, in a way, I would see as a positive opportunity. For sure, we have to manage, the employment impacts and the reskilling and so on. But that's much, much better than just having the sector disappear en masse, which is what has been happening so far.
What about the skills training and the vocational education necessary to ensure this new regime you're describing?
Yeah, that is going to be another critical ingredient, no doubt. And our research has identified, first of all, the failure of our kind of haphazard vocational education system in Australia, all of these public subsidies to private sort of fly-by-night training institutes. That has not worked. We should learn in this from the experts, in a place like Germany, where they treat vocational education as a prime career opportunity, not as a second chance institution. And they do it through stable public institutions, and they set up great training programs, registered trades, and then they got pipelines that take those graduates directly into high-skilled jobs. That's the kind of model that we need, and it's going to take rethinking on the vocational education front as well, certainly.
Yeah, well, there was an interesting story on 7:30 this week on ABC TV that is pertinent to this. Just have a listen. This is at the ANU and whether there are advanced manufacturing opportunities on offer as a result of their courses. This is the university, of course, worst affected by loss of revenue.
I think many of us have to consider to move on and probably look for opportunities elsewhere.
A global pharmaceutical company is finally interested in Dr. Paula Gonzalez's potential breakthrough for the treatment of autoimmune disease, lupus and extreme allergies, just as her job is at stake.
For me in particular, it's pretty hard to let go of a project that has such potential to change people's lives. And I think it's very short-sighted what we're seeing now.
So, I mean, we don't know if that global pharmaceutical company was planning to develop that treatment here in Australia, but it is interesting, isn't it, David? One small example illustrating how brittle it sounds, that you're almost on the point of possibly a big breakthrough in Australian innovation and manufacturing, but it's certainly not guaranteed and we might lose it.
It's certainly not. And one thing COVID has shown is that countries all over the world are now saying manufacturing matters even more than it did before COVID. The US is doing it, the UK is doing it, Germany is doing it. They're all pouring billions of investment into it. And so actually it's going to be an even more competitive environment. The advantage we've got here in Australia is that we have to date managed COVID well, and therefore we should be seen as a country and we should be attracting global talent and the global companies to put their global talent into Australia for the next few years. I think that's a great opportunity. But there's another opportunity that exists. We also sit very low down the tables of collaboration that takes place between businesses and universities. And so while the universities are rightly struggling because of international students and the loss of income, the flip side of that is there's an opportunity to increase the research and the collaborative partnerships with industry. And that's how you're going to bring smart people together to create new ideas that ultimately we can make in Australia. But we need to focus on making things in Australia that are right for the country and making sure we can compete on value and an opportunity to export. It can't just be about what we do inside the what's now being called Fortress Australia.
I just, again, a text. We've been very interesting texts from people. Two of my kids, one listener says, educated with taxpayer assistance, couldn't get engineering work here. Europe and the USA scooped them up. Now, I mean, we really hear a lot about this. Can you feel any changes coming on that?
Yeah, I can actually. In fact, when I go out to people in manufacturing today, the number one issue they have, and bearing in mind they've got a lot of issues at the moment with continued supply chain disruption, changes in the landscape, workplace changes with COVID, but the number one issue most of them have is I can't get the skills that I need. And actually where many of them are shifting is now towards getting digital or native digital talent, those people that can help them with data analytics and mapping out supply chains. It's a very different industry we're now looking at going forward. When you talk to Germany, they've moved beyond the language of things like it's about 3D printing and robotics. It's not about the technology, it's about what you do with the technology. And it's about rapidly digitalization of businesses, supply chains, both inside business, but across businesses and sectors. And that's the skill set that's going to be hard to find. The opportunity, however, is that's where the young kids, my kids, are coming through, learning things like coding at school, which was something that was a million miles from what I did. So I do see there's an opportunity, as Jim says, if we can streamline, create the right environment that industry and design for industry and manufacturing is an attractive industry. It's changing the messaging as much as anything else to make sure the kids are coming through. And again, that's something that other countries have had for generations, and we're now trying to rebuild.
Yes, I've wanted to do a story for a while about that skills base in the digital sector, which quite a lot of the people in the industry are sort of really screaming about. And so that we'll focus on that in weeks to come. Look, gentlemen, thank you very much. This is just the beginning of a discussion I hope we have more of. David Tutor and Jim Stanford, thank you so much for being with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
David Tutor is Managing Director of the Innovative Manufacturing CRC, Cooperative Research Centre. Jim Stanford, Director of the Australia Institute's Centre for Future Work. Thank you for your texts, some very interesting ones, really fresh too, interesting information coming through. Well, up next, we continue our diplomacy series with a woman who started off as a rare woman and lasted for 34 years, Sue Boyd.
Diplomacy is back at the center of our foreign policy.
My style in diplomacy is my style as a human being.
Diplomacy, John, the job of statesman.
And I thought it was drinking and dancing.
Sue Boyd was a diplomat for 34 years. Among the few women allowed professional roles in the old Department of External Affairs that's morphed into the present-day Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. It's just lost its first female leader. Frances Adamson, to become Governor of South Australia, announced this week. Sue learned fairly early in her career the three central questions every diplomat, wherever they are in the world, needs to be able to answer and articulate well back to superiors in Canberra. What's going on? What's it mean for Australia? And what should we do about it? And the man who summarised it so succinctly was Prime Minister Gough Whitlam back in 1974 after the Portuguese Carnation Revolution. Sue had been on post throughout that convulsion, which ultimately led to huge changes in East Timor, and he wanted to know what this 25-year-old could tell him, having been up close and personal on Australia's behalf. She's distilled an eventful career into her book, Not Always Diplomatic, an Australian woman's journey through international affairs. And I spoke to her first about the need to answer those three central questions.
That's right. That's what we're all on about. That's what we're sent overseas to do. That's what every diplomatic mission is supposed to do. And that's been my mantra throughout my career.
And did you know that when you began? Like, who put the enthusiasm into you? And I wonder sort of how much you learned along the way.
No, I think I learned along the way. My first posting, I had to look around to find something useful to do, and I found that colonial policy was the thing which was interesting and of interest to Australia, so I got stuck into that. And that got me to do some useful work other than sitting around drinking wine and eating nice Portuguese food. So that gave me something useful to do on my first posting, which otherwise I have to say, and this is amazing to listen to now, I had a farewell interview with the then Secretary of the Department, and he told me Portugal was a wonderful post, lovely food, wonderful wine, great people, great architecture, great history, it would be lovely. And I said, well, Secretary, that's terrific, but what about the work? He said, work? Don't you worry your pretty little head about that. Would you believe? He said, no, this mission is set up as a sort of facilitation for an immigration program. So, no, you just go and enjoy yourself.
Oh dear. I've been trying to scuttle the notion in this series that it is all about canapes and cocktails.
Well, exactly. But that's what he said. So I had to live it for myself and live the changed reality and then embody that and pass it on to younger people who worked with me. And that's been the guiding principle, what Whitlam said. And in fact, when the Secretary of the Department, Frances Adamson, kindly launched my book in Canberra a couple of months ago, she said someone in the PMO, the Prime Minister's office, had said to her, this was such an essential mantra that it ought to be tattooed on the forehead of everybody who left Australia.
What's going on? What does it mean for Australia and what should we do about it?
What we do about it, exactly.
So what can it reasonably achieve as a discipline? What can't it achieve? I think both questions are important.
I think that's right. I think the thing about diplomacy, it is essentially human contact. It's one person working with another or working with a group of people. It's a give and take. It's a learning about other people's needs. It's about working out compromises to reach an objective which is acceptable to both sides in the negotiation. And that's done in human terms. The electronic stuff and all the other stuff sort of supplements all that and provides, if you like, a modern framework. But that essential history, that's the essential nature of what diplomacy is about, I think.
What had you done to prepare for it? In other words, what was your education, would you say, if you had to really distill it?
Well, I was very lucky. I was brought up internationally. My father was in the British Army. I was brought up in lots of overseas countries. I learnt foreign languages from an early age. I learnt to be resilient. I learnt about other cultures. I learnt that different is not inferior. And I learnt to get on with other people. I went to 13 different schools in 8 different countries. So I had a wide international background, if you like, before I joined the Foreign Service.
Did you do anthropology, history, economics, that sort of thing?
No, I didn't. I had no idea that I was going to be a diplomat. That wasn't my plan, that just sort of happened. No, I did arts. I did, first of all, languages, then I studied politics. So I majored in politics and English drama, and then I did a diploma of education on top of that.
I don't think I actually let you say what it can't achieve. What are its limits?
I'm not sure, frankly, that there are any limits when it's done properly. I think the limitations are set up by people using inappropriate means of trying to achieve their ends and therefore setting up resistance elsewhere rather than facilitating conversations and facilitating exploration about what might be possible. So I think there's a danger in misusing the modern technology and, in fact, undermining traditional diplomacy.
I suppose what I'm maybe quietly asking is, do you see yourself as peacemaking? Is the aim to try to encourage a peaceful solution at all times or not?
Well, to the extent that you can, yes. But the bottom line is what your national interest is. And if you can get there by a way that facilitates what the other party wants as well, that's better than just doing your own thing and then having the people on the other side hostile to you and resistant to you and trying not to do what you want them to do. In my experience, you get an agreement between two parties where you've explored all the difficulties and all the possibilities and come to an agreement is more likely to be lasting, useful agreement than one that's imposed on another party.
You write in your book that you were in fear of your life, or it certainly becomes quite plain that you were during the Fiji coup crisis, which I think went on for 64 days, I think. Mm-hmm. Now, and you became utterly exhausted and you knew you couldn't go on. So this must be, well, what sort of memory is that? You were our representative, you were High Commissioner in Fiji.
And I realised that there were limits in what a person can do and your physical capacities and your mental capacities. And I recognised that I wasn't in a fit state then to make sensible decisions. And therefore the most sensible decision at the time was to hand over and go and have a rest. So I did. I handed over to Margaret Toomey, my deputy, and I went off to a hotel not too far away where some of the Australian staff were, and I collapsed there really for 3 or 4 days. And then I felt fine. Then I could come back again and take over again. But I think there's a danger if you don't recognise those limitations that you can make the wrong decisions.
Gee, that's quite a thing to do. You weren't worried about concerns that you couldn't hack it?
Not really. I think I recognised that that was the sensible thing to do. You know, the alternative was to say, get me out of here, but that really wouldn't help. I mean, we were there to do a job, and I wanted to do the job. And I had a very good staff who were all there and needing leadership, and a big Australian community in the country that was looking to us for leadership. So we just had to do it, and that was the way I managed to do it.
It was dangerous, wasn't it?
Well, they said so. We had threats against my life, but from a reliable source. I never got to the bottom of what that source was, but we sort of took it seriously at the time, and so we sent the staff home and did the things that we were supposed to do in those circumstances.
And what is your judgment on how Australia's national interest was served in that whole imbroglio?
Well, I think we were served very well indeed. What I managed to do, with instructions from home and support, was to negotiate with what had emerged to be an interim government and to persuade them that it was good to go to early elections and not to rest on their laurels and just continue to take the benefits of being in power. In our experience, interim governments, the longer they stay in government, the more comfortable they are and the less likely they are to actually call elections and move to democratic processes. And that's what we see happening in Fiji. So, and I encouraged them, and we helped them, and we gave them a lot of material support. In lots of little ways we helped. And I was the interface between the government and our government in all those negotiations.
What about when you disagree with the policy being pursued by your government, and yet you are bound to advocate for it, are you not?
That's right. And that is a difficult decision. I had that decision to make when the government imposed the Pacific solution on how to deal with asylum seekers.
This was in John Howard's time.
In John Howard's time. And I was instructed to go and ask them if any of them would help us by allowing us to set up a processing centre on their territory. And so I hated the idea of doing that. I just thought this policy was wrong. I thought we're a rich and generous country. We've benefited from migration. You know, we have the capacity to absorb these asylum seekers who have come from horrendous situations. And for us to try and push this off to poor Pacific Island states, I thought was just outrageous. But this was what I was instructed to do by a government, which was a legitimate government, the Australian government, which had a legitimate mandate, and I had to do it. The alternative was to say, I'm not going to do this, I'm going to resign and leave it for somebody else. But that actually wouldn't have affected the situation. What would have happened is somebody else would have done it, and it would still have happened. And what I could do was using my experience and my knowledge to try and implement this policy in a way that did the least harm to Australia's interests. And so I discussed that with the staff, and we agreed that that's the path we should go down. And so that's the path we went down. I didn't like it, but I recognised that that was the best thing to do in the circumstances.
Let's sort of wind up with some of your experiences as a woman in DFAT, as it became DFAT. And many people have acknowledged, and you do yourself, how many people have told you that you were really quite a role model because there were very few women in foreign affairs. In fact, your graduating class in 1970, there were 2 of you out of 23. And to your amazement, for doing exactly the same work, you discovered that you 2 were paid 10% less.
Yes, that's what it was then.
So how long did that take to be rectified?
Well, it took several years. I mean, government changed its position on women. The department changed its position. I was involved in the negotiating group, which worked out what the department had to do in order to achieve the objective, which was to have more women doing well in and getting through to more senior positions. We would get all right being taken in, but it was a question of getting up into more senior positions, going to embassies and so on. And or what happened when a couple were married, for example. What did you do about posting them? And what about women who were married and had children? And what did you have to do about facilitating their situation? So we negotiated all those, and I was involved in those negotiations. And so after years, and now, of course, there's a sort of almost equal number of women ambassadors to men ambassadors in the Australian Foreign Service. So after years, things changed, but it was a battle, and we had to keep pushing and have to sort of keep resisting efforts by people to denigrate us and undermine us and make life difficult for us. It was a constant battle.
And would you say that female representation and interpretation in cables is now taken as seriously as male?
I think so, yes. I think we're over the bump. I think now the situation in the department is very different from the situation that I was in.
And what about other treatment of you by other countries where the position of women is even worse?
Well, I never found that in the countries I was posted to. I found the position of being High Commissioner gave me respect, or Ambassador, and countries dealt with me appropriately when I was on overseas postings.
That was worse in Canberra.
It was worse in Canberra. But I'll tell you a quick story though about this. When I was at the United Nations, we were doing the disarmament work. And we were in a preparatory committee, which had an Indian ambassador as the chair, Ambassador Venkat. And every day at the close of business, he'd say, "Well, gentlemen, I think that completes our work for the day. I now close the session." So on the third day of that, I quickly took the floor and said, may I have the floor? Oh, yes, I give the floor to the charming delegate from Australia. I said, Mr. Chair, I said, we women on the committee are very tired. You have closed the session for the men for the last 3 days, but we women have been in constant session, and we are very tired. Would you mind closing the session for us as well? And he said, "Oh, I apologise to the most distinguished, most charming, most beautiful delegate of Australia. But when I was at school, my teacher taught us that man embraces woman unless otherwise specified." And I said, quick as a flash, "Ha, but I bet he didn't tell you that gentlemen don't embrace ladies unless specifically invited."
Oh, very good. So Indian-Australian relations proceeded beautifully. Look, very, very final question. What's your favourite reading material? You know, what would you recommend, or something to watch that people might like to really understand this craft of yours better?
I think there is a terrific book that's been written just recently by an American who's the current Minister for International Development, Samantha Power.
Oh, yes.
She was ambassador to the UN.
For Barack Obama.
For Obama. And she's written a wonderful book called The Education of an Idealist, which I think covers very well all the grassroots stuff through to the high government stuff, the implementation and the development of policy, as well as the making of it. And I think it's a wonderful book to understand the whole process which we as diplomats are involved in.
Lovely. Well, Sue Boyd, thank you very much indeed for taking part in our series.
Pleasure to have been here. Thank you.
And Sue Boyd recently wrote about her life in Not Always Diplomatic. It's published by University of Western Australia Press, and you can seek that out. Still to come in our diplomacy series, I'll be speaking with Martin Indyk in coming weeks and Geoff Raby. But next, the joy and challenge of being an adult beginner. When was the last time you tried to learn an entirely new skill? For most of us, it's probably been quite a while. You know, you can't teach an old dog new tricks and all that. Is there actually any truth to this? Well, Tom Vanderbilt doesn't think so. He's a journalist and the author of Beginners, The Curious Power of Lifelong Learning. And over the course of a year, he learned to play, wait for it, chess, to draw, to sing, to surf and to juggle. And that was just the start. He argues that if we can get over our anxieties about being an adult beginner, we have a surprising amount to gain. And I welcomed Tom to Saturday Extra.
Thank you. My pleasure.
It was very much through parenting, wasn't it, that you realised you had stopped learning new skills. Could you tell us about that, please?
Sure. I think many parents will recognize this experience, but I found myself taking my daughter to all of this wide range of classes and courses. And I was, of course, 100% behind this and encouraging her to learn all of these new skills. I quickly realized that I wasn't really living the life I was encouraging in her, and that it had actually been quite a long time since I had learned something new. So that sort of sent me into a tailspin of panic, and I wondered, number one, was it too late? What could I learn? How would that experience change me? And that led to this book.
And why do you think we tend to shy away from learning new skills as we get older?
Well, I think many people get caught up in things like their career or perhaps raising children, and these are things that consume a huge amount of our time. And sometimes with the free time that's left, one doesn't have the energy or the inclination. But then there are other things that go on as well, which is that there are a lot of things we may have been encouraged to try as children, which we perhaps weren't at the top of the class on necessarily, but we did have a certain sense of enjoyment from. But, we were gradually steered into the things we seem to be more proficient at. And for many people, it's very difficult to get back to those things. And what happens with people is that they're in this strange form of arrested development. I took a drawing seminar, and my instructor told me I was basically drawing like the last time I had actually drawn, which was something like an 8-year-old. So I had unearthed my frozen drawing talent from age 8, and there it was. It hadn't progressed. So I think, there's many reasons, many sources of this sort of inner negative self-talk telling you that you're not going to be great. There's not enough time. You're too old. You don't have a natural talent for that thing. And that was, of course, part of this process, overcoming all of those things.
And it all began with chess.
Yes, chess was one of these things that I had learned maybe a long time ago. I'd forgotten, never pursued, but was always mildly curious about. And this was even before, of course, the Queen's Gambit came and turned chess into the next hot thing. But my daughter, again, was this motivator. At around age 4, she saw a board and wanted to play. And I tried to learn. I felt like I wasn't really picking it up very well. So I thought, well, if she's going to learn, maybe she should get an expert for a little while. So admittedly, I'm a little bit of a sort of high-strung helicopter parent here who hires a chess coach for their 4-year-old. But when I did this, I thought, well, this is silly. Why shouldn't I actually try to learn at the same time, join in? And that's what, really brought up the pleasure of learning, and also of learning the same thing as my daughter, two novices separated by many years of life. And I think this is something that is a little bit underappreciated in society, the idea of learning things with our kids, not just teaching them what we know or taking them to those classes, but actually, jumping out there and getting right into it with them, which I think has all sorts of benefits.
Yes, I have a couple of personal observations which I might make for the end of the interview, having done this. It might get harder, but we don't, you say, actually lose our ability to learn new skills as we get older. In fact, you say that juggling studies show that the more learning we take on as adults, the faster we seem to learn.
Yeah, I think many people get caught in this sort of mental trap that only children can be very proficient learners. And there definitely is a certain brain profile in a young person that is optimized for learning. But a lot of the reason kids do so well with learning is a lot of lifestyle factors. They have nothing but time to do nothing but learn. They have a very encouraging audience around them. They learn in a very low pressure environment, which is something that the average adult beginner tends to put a lot of pressure on themselves when they take up something new. They sort of want to get good at it as soon as possible. And that just that's not the attitude that children necessarily have. The youngest children they're just immersing themselves in things like language and walking. And these are also the things that most of the things that kids learn are very important to simply being a human. They're not hobbies that they want to pick up. They're important life skills. So when we think about how children learn language so quickly, they want to communicate with their parents. They have a very strong reason to want to learn to speak.
Sure.
Which tends to be much stronger than the average person who, say, wants to pick up Italian because they're going on a trip to Venice. That's a tougher learning challenge there.
So do we know whether the brain enjoys this, or does the brain become overloaded? Because I can tell you, having taken up guitar, having done music all my life, piano and a little bit of violin, taking up the guitar, I am making progress, but I find it excruciatingly slow, and I get so frustrated with myself, and I wonder whether my brain is also frustrated.
The human brain, quite generally enjoys novelty and seeks out novelty. Perhaps you're at a stage where you're past novelty and you're too familiar with your own mistakes, perhaps. But
that's interesting. That's very interesting.
Well, I think there is a moment that people often equate learning with sort of pain. And that is true to a certain extent, because the moment your brain stops hurting is when the moment you've actually learned it. It's that process of forming these new neural connections, of taking on this new information that quite honestly can feel painful. I would find this in juggling. I would get quite proficient with a certain trick, and suddenly I had it, which felt good, but that also meant that I wasn't learning anymore. So
yeah, well, you actually, sorry to interrupt you, but you do say there's a typical pattern of, you know, the acquisition of skills, and you really move, and then you plateau, and in fact, you might even go backwards. It's a very familiar thing, I think, and then you make another boost.
Yeah, and what's going on there is a bit of a mystery. You know, there's some sort of, you know, reorganization of the brain going on as you work out these new problems. For me, it often involved trying to change up what I was doing because I was just stuck. And I would, you know, in surfing, for example, going to a new beach or changing the board I was using and really just getting out of the comfort zone I had put myself into in learning. And that's something that we often have to do because these plateaus are very real and they can be very discouraging. One of the great things about being a beginner is that there's so much progress in the beginning. There's a very steep learning curve in which you're making this progress very quickly, but then the plateaus can also be very daunting.
You do make the point that it needs a lot of humility. You know, you've got to ask for help. I've found that really challenging.
Indeed. I mean, there's this idea of intellectual humility that is really, a tonic for learning, because to learn something, you have to be open to the idea that you have something to learn. It's going to be a very difficult process for you if you go into something thinking you're already good at it or you already know that thing. And what I've become particularly proficient at in being a beginner is, as you mentioned, asking for help, asking the dumb questions, you know, raising my hand, identifying myself as the absolute beginner. You know, the thing is that people have seen it all. They are used to dealing with beginners. And if you go to a class that is filled with especially beginners or you know, maybe intermediates, I mean, no one is looking at you. This is the thing that people sort of get into their head, that they're going to die of embarrassment. But we sometimes feel other people are actually paying more attention to us than they really are. And this is something that I felt acutely aware of while doing something like surfing. And to be honest, no one really cared about what I was doing.
So learning in a group does matter or helps, does it?
Oh, indeed, yeah. Researchers call this a community of practice, where people can learn, in a sense, as much from other students as they can from the teacher, both in asking questions and in also observing the way people work through the problem that you're also faced with. And there's something more valuable even about watching a beginner or lower level person learn a skill than to see an expert do it flawlessly. That's actually a very inefficient way to learn, because number one, the person doing it probably can't even explain how they do it because they've made it automatic behavior. And so I found that, you know, really being amongst other beginners was a great, not just motivation and camaraderie, but a great pedagogical tool.
So, well, have you really overcome that sense of embarrassment at stepping in and looking a bit useless, I suppose? Or is my language giving me away?
No, it's a great question. And to be honest, I still have many of those fears. I mean, various people have asked me to sing. Once upon hearing that I was trying to learn to sing, they then want me to sing. And it's something that, you know, really has to be the right time and place. Yes. I have to sort of build up my comfort levels. But singing to people in public is one of the great reliable sources of human embarrassment. So much so that psychological researchers, when they wanted to study embarrassment, the thing that reliably made people embarrassed was to ask them to sing a song in front of other people. So when I first had to sing a few bars of a song on my very first vocal lesson, it was among the hardest things I've had to do in my adult life. But I tried to keep that idea in the back of my head that all this stuff was for fun. I already had a job. I didn't want other jobs. I didn't want other things that I had to treat the same way I treat my professional career. These were purely things to explore and have fun with. Yes, exactly. And
I mean, and the other important thing is we should point out you weren't actually trying to master any one of these new skills. I found this very interesting. In fact, it was the opposite.
Well, I mean, it's a good question. You know, what is mastery? A lot of people now take this Anders Ericsson, the psychologist, his famous definition of it taking 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to achieve expert level performance in a given field. And that's not a guarantee. That's just sort of a baseline. But so the question is, you know, I didn't have 10,000 hours for any of these things, much less 5 things. So I quickly had to, you know, come to an agreement with myself. What would constitute progress? And, you know, but I set very small goals. I think some people start a new skill and set these unrealistic goals, which come back to sort of bite them. A beginner surfer saying, "Oh, I'm going to be at Hawaii's North Shore in a year, getting barreled at Pipeline." I mean, that would be an absolutely unrealistic goal for a 48-year-old. My goals were very simple. Stand on the board while a wave is pushing me toward the shore, and we can go from there. But
and look, I've got to ask you again: did you come to enjoy it all? And what which of these different exercises you took on did you enjoy most?
I mean, luckily, I did enjoy them all, and that's why I sort of did multiple ones, because I was worried that I might get a little bit bored with something. And there's a lot of progress I could still make, a lot of avenues I could explore in any of these things. But I think, to your question, I think singing probably resonated the most, kind of stuck the most with me, and that may be because either it brings the most pleasure to me, or simply that it's the easiest thing to actually practice. And perhaps because it was the easiest thing to practice, I was able to make more progress, which then made me feel better about doing it, which was sort of this virtuous cycle that you unlock, that the better you feel, the more you want to practice, which it sounds like perhaps with your experience with the guitar, you might not be in quite that virtuous cycle. I'm not sure.
Look, I can be with effort. It's just, having been not a bad piano player, it's frustrating to sort of grade my sort of proficiency. But look, I am persisting. And final word of advice then, Tom, to listeners who might be contemplating getting out there and trying something new.
Well, I would just say, really the hardest thing for me, and I think for a lot of people, is simply the very first step, the threshold of beginnerdom, which is, whether signing up for that class or, calling that instructor and just quelling the chorus of inner voices you have that are telling you not to do this thing. And then, if it doesn't work out and it turns out not to be your passion, that's fine. There are a lot of other skills out there in the world. Your free time is precisely that. It's free. You have total control over it. So just not to let any sort of negative sources of thought enter the process, and really just try to enjoy the process, not focus on that end product of mastery.
Okay, there are various notes to self I'm taking from you. Thank you, Tom. It's been really lovely to talk to you.
Thanks so much.
And Tom Vanderbilt is a journalist and author. His latest book is Beginners, The Curious Power of Lifelong Learning, and it's published in Australia by Allen and Unwin. And several of you have taken up German and gone to Duolingo classes and loving it and persisting. So look, good on you. We have a rather cute text has come in too about our advanced manufacturing discussion. Innovation and manufacture was sexy until the ABC axed the new inventors. Time to bring it back. That's Alan from Ballina. I do absolutely remember the inventors. I think we all do. And there's another interesting one too, which I think I've got time to read. Is there an impact also here of how much money in Australia is invested in property instead of business, industry and growing ideas? For instance, in Germany, more people might put money into growing their family manufacturing business than expensive real estate because property has been made too attractive here. Yes, I think that is a very interesting point indeed. Thank you so much. And I want to thank also our fabulous team, Kate McDonald, Anne Arnold, Taryn Priadko and the engineer, Hamish Camilleri. And that's it for Extra with me, Geraldine Doogue. Thank you for your company today. And I do hope you can join us again next week. Bye-bye for now.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio, and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.